Welcome, the new video. In this recap, everyone expected a legendary giant, but the hero who arrived was just an ordinary man. Now, he must save an entire kingdom or die trying. In a beautiful kingdom called Lilliput, an ancient prophecy is about to be fulfilled. On this day, the king announces to his subjects that the great giant hero, named Gulliver, will return 40 years after saving everyone from the villain Blefuscu. The people sing in celebration of the hero, who at any moment will walk through the kingdom's enormous gate. Suddenly, heavy footsteps are heard, and everyone believes that the great Gulliver has finally arrived. But the one who walks through is a man as small and ordinary as the residents of Lilliput. A week earlier, Gulliver had broken into the palace of the king of Lupusburg. While the soldiers slept in the tavern, the young adventurer rescued a little mouse that was trapped in a mousetrap under the table. He then tries to slip past unnoticed, but accidentally steps on a plank, which knocks over the soldiers' axes and spears. Fortunately, the little mouse he saved comes to his aid and holds all the weapons, but they're too heavy, and he drops one of them on a soldier's head. The noise wakes everyone nearby, including the army general. He immediately orders everyone to capture the intruder, and Gulliver flees down the staircase alongside his new mouse friend. The pair reaches the top of the tower, but their path is blocked by a soldier armed with a giant axe. Gulliver finds himself surrounded, but using his agility, he runs along the walls, leaps over the giant soldier, and kicks him so hard that he knocks him down onto the rest of the soldiers. With them out of the way, Gulliver makes his way to the king's chamber, where he finds his precious crown. He finally grabs it, but just then the general and his men storm into the room, along with the burly soldier, who hurls his axe and narrowly misses Gulliver. The group then rushes to capture him, but the adventurer manages to escape through the window and leaps toward the sea, where his ship awaits him. The next day, Gulliver places the king's crown alongside the other treasures he found and adopts the little mouse from the castle, naming him Squick. The two are about to set sail when a rowboat pulls up alongside the ship, and out steps the messenger Pablo. He brings a message from Lilliput, saying that the people of the kingdom need his help. Upon hearing this, Gulliver hoists the sails and sets out across the sea toward Lilliput. After days of travel, he finally arrives at the kingdom. However, the king doubts that this is the real Gulliver, since everyone believed him to be a giant. Gulliver tries to prove his identity, but the king orders him to be sent to court. There, the adventurer is placed in a cage, and shortly afterward, the king appears, dressed as a judge, and announces that he will decide Gulliver's case. However, in addition to presiding over the trial, the king also takes on the roles of prosecutor and witness. In all these versions, he accuses Gulliver of being an imposter, and with that, the verdict is about to be handed down, until suddenly, a young woman appears disguised as a lawyer and steps in to defend Gulliver. She tries to prove his innocence, but the judge sentences him to execution for his alleged crime. Desperate, Gulliver begs for a retrial, and Squick sets out to help his friend. However, the guards take them both to prison until the day of the sentencing. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Blefuscu, the king plans to take revenge on Lilliput, but is informed by his subjects that Gulliver has returned. However, he discovers that this so-called hero has been arrested for not being the giant the legends described, and intends to proceed with his plan. Later, Gulliver and Squick are locked in a cell. What the soldiers didn't count on was that the little mouse could easily slip through the bars of the cell, and thanks to that, he sets out to retrieve the key, which is in one of the guard's pockets. The little animal begins to follow him unnoticed, but the guard walks through one of the doors and locks it from the inside. Unable to get through there, Squick looks for another way out. Nearby, Gulliver tries to pick the lock on the door but is interrupted by the king, who appears with the prison keys. He has come to inform the prisoner of his sentence, but the adventurer tries to convince the king that he's having a better life in prison, with food and plenty of comfort. The king grows jealous and orders the prisoner to leave, while he tries out the supposed good life in his cell. Without wasting any time, Gulliver leaves the madman behind and sets out in search of his mouse friend. On the way, he runs into Marcy, the same young woman who had disguised herself as a lawyer on the jury. She explains that she tried to defend Gulliver, but he isn't convinced, since he was still found guilty in court. The two argue until Squick shows up, and Gulliver decides to leave with him. Marcy offers to help, but the adventurer refuses and sets out to find a way out on his own. However, he soon discovers that the prison is a huge maze, and his attempts to escape are futile. With no other choice, he accepts Marcy's help. In a matter of seconds, she finds a secret passage in the wall that leads them straight out of the prison. Back inside, the king continues to enjoy his life as a prisoner, until one of his assistants informs him that Gulliver has escaped. Realizing he's been tricked, He flies into a rage and sounds the alarm so the fugitive can be captured. Soon, the entire Lilliputian army sets out in pursuit of Gulliver, who flees with Squick and Marcy through the city. The soldiers hurl spears and axes at the group, but Gulliver is agile and fights back with his strong, swift kicks. They continue to flee until Marcy leads them to the top of a church under construction. The soldiers begin to surround the area, so the group runs toward another building and, with a leap, manages to break through the window. Even so, the soldiers aren't about to give up and storm the building, forcing Gulliver and his friends to flee through the hallways. From there, they make their way to the main hall and escape by swinging from a chandelier and climbing out the window. Outside the building, the trio climbs onto a wagon and begins racing down a huge slope at high speed. Since the wagon has no brakes, the three can't stop and are hurled toward a large lake. Fortunately, none of them were hurt, and they swim toward a harbor. Still, the soldiers continue to search for them, and Marcy decides to take Gulliver to one of her old friends, Freelock. They make their way through a vast forest, which Gulliver finds strangely familiar. Marcy says that a long time has passed and things have changed, but to the adventurer, it's been only a year since he left Lilliput to explore other places. The girl tries to explain how the world has changed since he left, but Gulliver doesn't take her seriously and thinks Marcy simply doesn't know the kingdom that well. She gets furious at his arrogance and goes off to gather firewood, while Gulliver goes out to do the same. Upon returning to camp, he sees that Marcy has already built a fire and apologizes to her for his behavior. The girl accepts his apology, and the two begin to talk by the fire, with Gulliver recounting his incredible adventures around the world throughout the night. The next morning, Gulliver wakes up feeling very cold and realizes that winter has already arrived in Lilliput. Marcy explains that time passes more quickly in this kingdom because the king signed a decree making the years go by faster, so that Gulliver would return as soon as possible. This confuses the young man, and he asks Marcy to take him to his friend Freelock to get further explanations. Finally, they arrive at Freelock's house, but his friend is much older and is just as disappointed that Gulliver isn't a giant as the other residents of Lilliput. Furthermore, he reveals that Marcy is his daughter, proving that while Gulliver was away, several years had passed in the kingdom. Because of this, the people who knew him had died, with the exception of Freelock, who had tried to tell everyone the truth. However, people only believed in the legend of the giant hero and began to mock Freelock and his daughter. Since then, the old pirate decided to accept this story and waited for Gulliver's return to prove the truth. Devastated by this story, Gulliver tries to reconcile with his friend and sings a song they used to share on their adventures. Freelock is moved and embraces his companion, but the moment is interrupted by the king's soldiers, who arrest Gulliver and Marcy. Freelock uses his brute strength to confront the king's servants, but the soldiers outnumber him and manage to subdue the enormous pirate. Finally, they arrest Freelock and bring Gulliver, Marcy, and Squick before the king so that the sentence may be carried out. Later, in front of the castle, the king delivers a long speech about the punishment the impostor and his accomplices will receive. Gulliver begins to grow impatient with the delay and makes his final request, that the king shut his trap. As expected, the king doesn't like this one bit and decides to carry out the sentence right then and there. He dresses up as an executioner and orders his soldiers to line up the prisoners so their heads can be cut off in front of everyone. However, the madman had cut holes in the wrong places on his mask and, as a result, cannot see his targets. He begins swinging the axe in the wrong places, and Gulliver seizes the opportunity to apologize to Marcy and declare his true feelings for her. However, before he can do so, the moment is interrupted when two ambassadors from Blefuscu bring a message to the king. The message states that Lilliput will be besieged by King Blefuscu's army and that, if they do not surrender, the kingdom will be taken by force. The king of Lilliput is worried, but he soon tries to deceive the ambassadors by telling them that the legendary hero has returned and will crush King Blefuscu's army. The ambassadors leave to deliver this message, while the king of Lilliput decides to invite Gulliver to a lavish dinner. In the middle of the meal, he says he needs the hero's help to stop King Blefuscu, or all of Lilliput will be in grave danger. Gulliver accepts the proposal, but in exchange, he asks that his friends be released, along with the payment of a large sum of treasure. The king accepts the terms, but Gulliver isn't sure if he can defeat an entire army on his own. However, His Majesty has already devised a plan, and just as he issued a decree that made time run faster, he will issue another one, declaring that Gulliver is, in fact, a giant. The two then seal the deal, and the king releases Squick and Marcy from prison. Hours later, His Majesty announces his new decree, stating that Gulliver is the giant hero who will save the kingdom of Lilliput. The decree spreads throughout the city, though some still doubt that Gulliver is truly a giant. To prove that this is true, The hero promises to fulfill the prophecies regarding his return, the two most important of which are rebuilding the city walls and repairing the water supply. So, with the help of his friends, he begins to turn the prophecies into reality. His first act is to use a catapult to destroy the makeshift blockage on the wall and replace the missing section. The first stage of the plan works, and he destroys the barricade, but the impact sends the catapult careening down a huge slope, and it careens out of control through the city. Luckily, Gulliver manages to stop it before anyone gets hurt and sets out to close the wall with the missing section. During the process, the machine lowering the section of the wall gets stuck. Quickly, Gulliver grabs a spear and throws it at the counterweight's rope, causing the section of the wall to descend and seal the opening perfectly. The prophecy has been fulfilled, but they still need to secure the water supply. To do this, Gulliver, Marcy, and Freelock go to the dam and stack dozens of barrels of gunpowder there. Next, Squick and the pirate's little dog named Anchor swing on a rope and use a lit match to ignite the fuse. The resulting explosion shatters the dam's stones, allowing water to flow through the pipes and restoring the water supply to normal. Thanks to these heroic deeds, Gulliver is greeted with applause by everyone in the city. He thanks them for their gesture but says that the true meaning of being a giant lies not in his size, but in his actions to help others. Everyone is moved by this message, except for the ambassadors from Blefuscu, who heard Gulliver's words. However, since they are hidden, they do not realize that the hero is not actually a giant and return to Blefuscu to report the information they have gathered. After telling the king everything they had discovered, Blefuscu remains undaunted and sets sail with his vast army across the sea, heading for the kingdom of Lilliput. The next day, Gulliver takes a walk through the city with Marcy and thanks her for everything she and her father have done. He is also about to tell her how much he likes her, but the romantic moment is interrupted by soldiers, who seem to be fleeing from something. Soon after, the king of Lilliput himself runs for his life, as the vast army of Blefuscu is approaching his kingdom. Gulliver tries to convince them to stay and fight to protect the people, but the king leaves that to the hero, as per the agreement they had made. Finally, the ships of Blefuscu land on the beach of Lilliput, and from within them emerges the king's vast army, accompanied by enormous war machines. It doesn't take long for the walls of Lilliput to be surrounded by more than 10,000 soldiers, armed and ready for battle. Seeing no other way out, Gulliver suggests that the entire population be evacuated so they might have some chance of survival. However, Freelock says that all the Lilliputians are willing to defend their kingdom, no matter what happens. The people's courage gives the hero new motivation, and he tries to come up with a plan to save everyone. Minutes later, the king of Blefuscu grows impatient and orders the supposed giant hero to come forward and face him. Instead, Freelock appears and says he has a proposal from Gulliver, inviting the king to meet him inside the city walls to reach an agreement. However, the villain rejects the proposal and challenges Gulliver to go to the battlefield and face him, face to face. Then, the gates of Lilliput are opened, and Gulliver goes to the king alone and introduces himself as the true giant. The king mocks him and calls him a fraud, but Gulliver says he will prove himself to be Lilliput's hero through a duel. He challenges the king and proposes that, if Blefuscu wins, he will rule over Lilliput and be considered a legend for having defeated a giant. However, if he is defeated, he must leave Lilliput with his army and never return. The king is tempted by the proposal and decides to accept it, as he is convinced he will be the victor. So, the next morning, Blefuscu's army and Gulliver's friends gather for the great duel. Armed with their swords, the duelists face off as they await the start of the fight. Finally, the gong sounds, and King Blefuscu begins the duel with rapid sword strikes, while the hero of Lilliput struggles to block the attacks. Seeing that his opponent is skilled, Gulliver retreats to a spot filled with huge boxes to break the king's concentration. His tactic works, and Blefuscu is forced to move the boxes out of his way. The battle continues among the soldiers' tents until the two reach the army's pantry. Inside, Gulliver uses the surroundings to his advantage and hurls pots and food at the king. Despite this, the villain is relentless and lunges to attack Gulliver, who grabs a huge pot lid and uses it as a makeshift shield. Blefuscu strikes with even greater force and shoves the hero toward a massive barrel, which spins off until it collides with some barrels of liquor. Gulliver manages to recover, but the king charges furiously toward him. Once again, the hero is one step ahead. With his sword, he removes the lid from one of the barrels, causing the liquor to splash all over his opponent's face. The king flies into a rage and lunges at Gulliver, but Gulliver kicks him toward the barrels. This blow leaves the king dazed, and as he tries to get back up, the hero immediately points his sword at him and orders the villain to admit defeat. Thus, the duel ends and Gulliver is declared the victor. However, the king is not willing to give up so easily. In a treacherous act, he steps into a massive robotic suit of armor that had been hidden, and with it, he throws punches and fires cannon shots at the hero. Thanks to his agility, Gulliver manages to escape, but finds himself forced to flee from the enormous robot, which pursues him relentlessly. Blefuscu fires several cannon shots, and Gulliver manages to dodge them. However, the impact knocks him to the ground. The king seizes the opportunity and grabs him with the suit's robotic arm, then immediately hurls him against the wall. Marcy and Freelock rush to help their friend, but at that very moment, the weather in Lilliput begins to change rapidly. Marcy decides to use this to her advantage and tells Gulliver to pretend to be the legendary hero, capable even of changing the weather at will. He follows this plan and tells the king that, with his power, he will summon rain and lightning if the king remains in Lilliput. The ruse works, and in a matter of seconds, rain, lightning, and snow blanket the area, thanks to the rapid passage of time in the kingdom. This terrifies Blefuscu, so Marcy seizes the opportunity to shoot an arrow at his armor and enlists the help of Squick and Ancora, who rush in to attack the villain. Finally, Gulliver takes advantage of the distraction and ties the robot's legs with a rope, while Freelock uses his sledgehammer to finish him off with powerful blows. The king is forced to climb out of his armor, only to be chased by the little dog Ancora, who sends him far away. Thanks to their teamwork, Gulliver and his friends manage to save the kingdom of Lilliput. To celebrate this victory, the hero and Marcy finally declare their love with a beautiful kiss in front of everyone. Minutes later, the king of Lilliput appears and tries to take advantage of the situation, but the people know that he had been hiding throughout the entire battle. As punishment, they depose him and choose Gulliver to be the new king. However, the adventurer declines the offer and decides to hand the crown over to his friend Freelock, whom he considers more worthy of the position. Freelock is moved by the gesture and promises to rule Lilliput with justice and dignity. Days later, Gulliver and Marcy are about to set sail in search of new adventures. They say goodbye to everyone, and Gulliver asks that the decree on the passage of time be revoked, so that they may return without things having changed too much. Freelock agrees and gives his blessing to his best friend and his daughter. Finally, the couple sets sail on their ship, along with Squick and Anchor, after having proven to the entire kingdom of Lilliput that being a giant has nothing to do with size, but rather with courage. Subscribe for more recap videos.